All right, so we are going to continue talking about our arterioles, and we're going to kick it off with a question. Okay, so last time we talked about active and reactive hyperemia. Next, so I want you to go ahead and pick as many things from this list as you want that are true about active hyperemia. Okay, take another minute to select your choices. Take a look. Okay, great. This is looking good. Okay, so the reason we're asking this, right, is last time we were talking about local control of arterioles, and we were talking about that because we want to understand how arterioles are able to change the blood flow to specific parts of the body or specific organs. So one of the ways that we had intrinsic, really local control is active hyperemia. And this is something that happens when we have metabolically active tissue. So tissue organs that are working really hard, need lots of energy. They're doing lots of cellular respiration. Okay, so overall, our result, like the whole point of this, is that we want more blood flow to that tissue. So yes, we are going to have vasodilation, because as that arteriole dilates, so gets bigger, right? Radius is bigger, which means resistance is lower. When we have low resistance, we get more blood flow, right? Okay. So that also accounts for this resistance of the blood vessels going to that location, to that organ system. Okay. Now the other two have to do with like the direct kind of cause of this, so like what the smooth muscle in the wall of the arteriole is actually reacting to. And that has to do with those concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the situation that we're setting up, right? Because this tissue is metabolically active, hence active hyperemia, right? This means that we're using up all our oxygen, right? So our oxygen is being consumed. It's being consumed super fast. So we see the oxygen levels neighboring that smooth muscle in the walls of the arteriole dropping. At the same time, right, when we think about metabolism, when we think about aerobic cellular respiration, we're using oxygen to do that oxidative phosphorylation, and we're producing carbon dioxide as we break down that glucose, right? The carbon dioxide is one of our waste products, okay? So this fourth one is kind of paired, right? We're using too much oxygen, or we're using lots of oxygen, which means we're also producing lots of carbon dioxide, and that's starting to build up in the extracellular fluid. So that fluid in the space next to the arteriole. This is part of what our smooth muscle is reacting to. Okay. Great. So that's pretty much where we were last time. We've got one more intrinsic factor to think about before we move on to our extrinsic factors. Okay. So our final piece of our intrinsic control of blood flow to our organs is something called the myogenic response. Okay. So we've seen this root myo before. Anytime we see myo, we're thinking muscle. Myo means muscle or anatomy and physiology. So this is a muscle response. Genic is kind of like genesis, right? So generated by the muscle is the myogenic response. So what's happening here is that we have this blood vessel, this arteriole, changing its resistance in response to the stretch that the muscle in the wall of that vessel itself is feeling, okay? So what we're talking about, I'm gonna draw us like a little cross section through a blood vessel. So we got an outer layer of some connective tissue. We've got a layer of muscle next. And then we've got that endothelial layer inside, right? Or roughly our layers, okay? And then the blood is in the center, okay? So what happens if we are pumping a lot of blood to that arteriole, right? That blood exerts a pressure on the walls of the blood vessel. We saw that when we were talking about like the aorta and how it acts as a pressure reservoir, right? So it was keeping that pressure as those walls stretch, right? Okay, so I'm just going to draw that muscle layer in red again, right? But when we have more blood flow, right, I'm going to draw a bigger B for more blood flow, right? So we have stretched out this muscle because it goes around. So this was our smooth muscle. To get bigger, you have to stretch it. Okay. We know that it's starting out with like a certain amount of tone because that's how smooth muscle is, right? So it's not all the way down as small as it could be. It's not all the way out as big as it could be. So it's sensing that we've stretched it out a little bit as we've had more blood pumping here. Okay. So what happens then, right, is basically that's going to clamp back down, right? Like it's stretched, it's going to kind of bounce back, basically, is the gist of what's happening with this myogenic response. But we could walk through why, right? Like in more detail, which is what this section is. Okay. So what's happening is that we're increasing blood flow first across the arteriole, right? What perfusion pressure is basically the pressure difference across an organ, right? So that delta P, we've been talking about it in terms of the whole the whole cardiovascular system, right? But if we wanted to talk about it across a single organ, we could. And we have that same thing, right? Like, so pressure means we're going to want to have fluid moving from high pressure to low pressure. So that's what the perfusion pressure is. So we're saying that we have a change in this pressure across the organ, this pressure gradient. So we've got an increase in blood flow across that arteriole. So now that we have this increase in pressure and increase in flow, that arteriole stretches out, right? So it's got bigger. We've got this circular muscle, kind of like a sphincter, right? So we stretch it out to make it bigger. And then an inherent property of smooth muscle is that it doesn't really like that, right? So it bounces back when it's stretched out too much, just like a rubber band kind of. So an inherent property of smooth muscle is that in response to that stretch, we have contraction. Okay. So we've got that smooth muscle contracting that, okay? And we know a word specifically for the contraction of a blood vessel, which is vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction is the result of that smooth muscle bouncing back, okay? So we can use this same flow equation, right? So what we've done as we bounce back, that radius got small, which means that our resistance got bigger, which means that the flow would go back down, right? So basically what's happening here is that we're trying to make things consistent, right? So this is auto-regulation, because this is how we keep from having like an increase in blood flow, just like blowing out your arterioles super big and messing stuff up, right? So when we talked about homeostasis, right, like we know that we can make things go up, right? Like we can take our, whatever it is we're tracing, our regulated variable is our specific term, right? A regulated variable can change in one direction, get pulled back down, can change in the other direction, get pulled back up. It's very negative feedback, right? So we talked about factors that can increase blood flow. Like in this example, our change is an increase in that difference in pressure, right? And an increase in flow. And we know that that could happen, for example, as like an active hyperemia situation or a reactive hyperemia situation, are two that we talked about. Okay. But we wouldn't want that to go on forever, right? Like we want that to stabilize back. So once we feel that stretch, increase the blood flow, we also want ways that we can kind of clamp back down. So that's our final piece of this system for intrinsic control. So questions about intrinsic control at this point before we move forward into extrinsic control. In that case, right, so we have this whole picture. This is for that myogenic response, right? So what we're looking at is the increase in perfusion pressure, causing a stretch of arterial or smooth muscle, causing that vasoconstriction, causing an increase in resistance, dropping that flow back down, decreasing the flow to that arteriole. So overall, we're going to see that by controlling arterial radius, we can change the distribution of blood flow to each of our organs. So for an example, here we can see the difference between where our blood is going when you're at rest versus where it's going proportionally when you're exercising, right? So a difference does occur in cardiac output, right? So you are pumping more blood, right? Or faster, you're pumping your blood faster when you're exercising. But because of this ability to regulate arterial radius, and therefore resistance and therefore flow, it doesn't just get evenly spread out between all your organ systems. When you're exercising, we're directing that blood flow specifically a lot to these skeletons. So as we talk about extrinsic control, we're going to kind of understand a bit about why. Before we do that, we are going to be thinking about the relationship between all of those factors in our flow equation, right? So far, right, we had our flow equivalent to the difference in pressure over the resistance, right? So we know that actually we've been talking about cardiac output and mean arterial pressure and total peripheral resistance, right? So this is just the same equation, except we've been a little bit more specific here. Now, we've been talking about how we could increase or decrease flow, really because we've been building our way to arterioles and flow to organs. But we're going to see that when we think about the cardiovascular system as a whole, this equation is really like a relationship between these three things rather than like a set of directions. So we're going to see that we can have a way to control mean arterial pressure as well. Okay, so this is also a relationship that's going to show us what happens as we try to control blood pressure. So looking at this, what do you think is going to happen if we raise our total peripheral resistance, right? So we're regulating those arterioles, right? We've maybe vasoconstricted them, maybe vasodilated them. I think, yeah, I'm giving you a rise in total peripheral resistance, so that'll be vasoconstriction, it's down, resistance up. So we know how that might affect flow in absence of other things, but your heart is kind of controlling that cardiac output. Okay, so what would happen to the mean arterial pressure then if the heart is kind of stabilizing the amount of blood it's pumping? Take another couple seconds. All right, so we are going to dive into, a little bit, a whole chunk of information about how we regulate blood pressure, but already right at this point, right, we can reshape that equation that we've set up into an equation that shows us how we might be affecting the blood pressure with some of these factors that we're changing, like resistance in the arterioles. So that's what's on the next slide. Okay, so this is basically what we were predicting, right? So we had our flow rule, we set it up with our actual variables that we're thinking about right now. So our cardiac output equivalent to our mean arterial pressure, because we're ignoring pressure in the veins because there almost isn't any, and our resistance, our TPR. Okay. So we can reshape this equation again, right? So move our total peripheral resistance over, right? And then you got total peripheral resistance times our cardiac output is going to give us our mean arterial pressure, right? So basically our average blood pressure, weighted average, so that we account for the fact that diastole takes double the time of systole. So as we move forward and think about, okay, we're changing resistance, changing cardiac output with some of these factors, we're going to also expect to see changes to blood pressure. We can even get a little bit more specific here because we know some more specifics about cardiac output, right? So we can add in our calculation of cardiac output. Okay, so if we want to know all our pieces together, we've got that our mean arterial pressure is going to be I'll do it in the same order here. So our resistance, TPR, right? So that has to do with the state of constriction out in our arterioles times cardiac output, which is our stroke volume. So every time your heart beats, how hard is it contracting? How much blood is it pumping out for each heartbeat? Times our heart rate. Oops. Times our heart rate, which is how many heartbeats do we have per minute? I'm saying this because we're going to be thinking a little bit more about our nervous system, right? So in our unit on the heart, we talked about how our autonomic nervous system can affect stroke volume, can affect heart rate. Now we're going to be thinking about how can our autonomic nervous system and related hormones affect our blood pressure, right? So we've already done this piece, the stroke volume, heart rate. Now we're going to look at those effects on our total peripheral resistance. Okay. So, having said that, this is part of why we're paying attention to some of our receptor types when we talked about autonomics. So we have a receptor example here with a high affinity for norepinephrine. It has an excitatory effect on its effector organs, and it involves the signaling molecule IP3. So do we remember what type of receptor we're talking about here? All right, take another couple seconds and then we'll take a look. All right. Okay. So yes, the answer is an alpha adrenergic receptor. Specifically, this is our alpha-1 receptor. Okay. So ways we should be remembering this is we've got that norepinephrine piece, right? Norepinephrine tells us that this has to be an adrenergic receptor, right? Because our adrenergic receptors are the ones that respond to those neurotransmitters and related hormones coming from our sympathetic nervous system. So they're reacting to norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are also referred to sometimes as noradrenaline and adrenaline, which is where the word adrenergic is coming from. Okay. And that's because those adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys, which are part of our renal system. Okay, so that's the adrenergic piece. Right? A cholinergic receptor would be responding to acetylcholine, which was part of our parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? We know it's alpha because of that bit with, there are two ways we can get there, right? Part of it is that high affinity for norepinephrine. The other part is that we know that all of our beta receptors are activating the cyclic AMP pathway. So since we're not talking about cyclic AMP, it can't be a beta receptor. So I was asking that because we are about to talk about what this has to do with our blood vessels. Okay. So reminder, here we're looking at our map of the sympathetic nervous system. So the different pathways that we're getting out to our effector organs. And so now we're going to know that the smooth muscle in our blood vessels is one of the effector organs for the sympathetic nervous system, right? We had our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands that we were going to for our autonomics, right? So now we know that there's smooth muscle in our blood vessel walls. So here it comes. Okay, so here's our sympathetic nervous system. We have our preganglionic neurons, which are cholinergic because they release acetylcholine here at the ganglion. Our postganglionic neurons are adrenergic, releasing norepinephrine. Okay. Or in the case of the adrenal glands specifically, we've got this modified chromaffin cell here that releases our hormone epinephrine primarily. So since we're talking about smooth muscle, right, what we're thinking about now is these effector organ cells are now, we're thinking all of them as smooth muscle in our blood vessel walls. We got to think about how they react when our sympathetic nervous system gives out these signals. Okay. So when we talk about extrinsic control of our arterioles, and therefore also of our mean arterial pressure, blood pressure, part of what's happening here is that we have hormones. And by hormones, we're really mostly thinking about epinephrine at this point, right? Coming from the adrenal gland. And our neurotransmitters coming out of those sympathetic postganglionic neurons. Okay? So when we say extrinsic, we mean a signal coming from somewhere far away, not something local, right? So the far away here is the nerves carrying the signal or the blood circulating those hormones. This is why this is extrinsic. So for this extrinsic control, we're going to start with what's going on with those sympathetic nerves. Okay. So I'm going to draw us just another reminder map of that sympathetic nervous system. Right. So we have nerves coming out of the central nervous system, moving into our peripheral nervous system. Okay. And then we had some branches, right? So all of the nerves that we really focused on were like motor nerves coming out of the central nervous system, going into the peripheral nervous system, right? We didn't really differentiate between signals coming in, right? So we know that when we have those efferent, so efferent going out nerves, we had to break down between somatic nerves, right? Somatic. Do you remember where those were going? Well, you're all answering in your heads, but the answer is skeletal muscle. Okay. So that was all our named skeletal muscles. And then our other secret kind of automatic part of the nervous system were our autonomics. Okay. So these are the ones that go to our heart, so cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, which is what we're focusing on now, as well as our glands. And our autonomics are divided into our sympathetics, which is the like fight or flight part of our nervous system. So fight or flight, sympathetics, thinking stress, right? Versus our rest and digest, right? We like these little rhyming things, our parasympathetics. So what we're saying here, when we say that the sympathetic nervous system is partially responsible for controlling the arteriolar radius, so we're saying that we have nerves coming out of the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system. They're still coming out, efferent. We're talking about autonomic nerves, so they're operating in relative secrecy, involuntary control. And specifically, we're thinking about this fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system. that's helping us release norepinephrine and epinephrine, which our adrenergic receptors respond to. Okay. It can do that because we are going to see that smooth muscle has adrenergic receptors in it to receive that signal from our nervous system. Okay. Right. So we have sympathetic innervation to the smooth muscle. That's our first thing. We have nerves that go there. Okay. Specifically, a fact that is true about those smooth muscle cells is that mainly the type of receptor that we have, right? So imagine a smooth muscle cell, right? Smooth muscle cell. I didn't mean to pause that. Yeah. Smooth muscle cells look kind of like teardrop-y shape, right? So we're going to have alpha adrenergic receptors here. Okay, so our alpha adrenergic receptors are present on our smooth muscle cells to receive norepinephrine and epinephrine from our sympathetic nervous system. And this is true pretty much throughout the body, except for in the brain. The brain is protected basically from a lot of things. And so the brain is kind of doing its own thing. But everywhere else in the body, if you have a blood vessel, have smooth muscle there, you'd expect it to probably have some alpha adrenergic receptors on it. Okay. One of the things that is true about our alpha adrenergic receptors is they like norepinephrine. They preferentially bind norepinephrine, have a high affinity for norepinephrine. Right. So what they really like is norepinephrine to come in and bind to the receptors. Right. So we can have our nice little norepinephrine bound here. And once it's bound, we're going to have a reaction set off within the cell because we've got these G protein coupled receptors. So we got a whole signaling pathway in the cell that's going to lead to some reaction. So specifically what the smooth muscle does when those alpha receptors bind norepinephrine is they're going to constrict, right? They're going to contract, they're going to get smaller, causing vasoconstriction in that blood vessel. So as those smooth muscle cells contract, we're causing vasoconstriction. We've got a smaller radius, which means we have more resistance, right? Our measure of overall resistance in the body is our total peripheral resistance, TPR. So TPR goes up. And this is why we did the setup for how that's related to blood pressure, right? So when we have total peripheral resistance go up, this has the effect of also increasing the blood pressure, increasing that. So this is going to be a lot of steps, but this is one of the ways we can kind of control the blood pressure when we need to. Okay. So like, moving back to that first day, right? The Parkinson's video we watched with our NOH, that first letter, the N was for neurogenic orthostatic hypotension, right? So low blood pressure upon standing due to an issue with the nerves, right? So now we can start to piece on some of why that might happen, right? So if you have a nerve, a sympathetic nerve, that's not working correctly, right? Say it's not working correctly, it's not signaling right to the smooth muscle. Smooth muscle wouldn't constrict, right? When that nerve gives out its norepinephrine or doesn't give out its norepinephrine, which means you can't vasoconstrict, which means you can't raise the blood pressure when it drops. We'll talk about why blood pressure drops when you stand up in a while. Basically, I think that's around when we get to veins, but don't remember quite the order at this point. Okay. So here's just that table from your book, reminding you of our types of receptors, right? So we've just said that smooth muscle, right? So smooth muscle, now we are kind of paying attention to what effector organs have each type of receptor, right? So we've got smooth muscle with our alpha receptors, which are preferentially binding norepinephrine. They like norepinephrine better. They have a high affinity for norepinephrine with an excitatory effect on those effector organs. Right, and I want you to take a look at this table for a second and predict for yourselves what other receptor type will be mentioning other than those alpha receptors. Hopefully we're noticing that another thing that might be reacting to the sympathetic nervous system, right? We're going to see that some of our blood vessels, but not all of them, are going to have beta-2 receptors. And when we activate those beta-2 receptors, that process is going to be different because they really highly prefer epinephrine, right? So that's already a different pathway we're reacting to, right? So we got that hormone there. And we know that those beta-2 receptors are inhibiting our effector organs. So we're going to see a whole different thing going on when we get to that piece. So this is kind of why we did it. Why we looked at this stuff before. Okay. So when we're talking about where we have our different types of receptors, so we expect to see those alpha receptors pretty much all over the place for our smooth muscle. So in blood vessels in your hand, in blood vessels in your knee, and blood vessels in your gut, you'd expect to see those alpha receptors. Okay. When we're talking about arterioles that go specifically to skeletal and cardiac muscle, okay, and I'm going to do a little drawing to specify what's going on here, right? So we're not saying to the skeletal and cardiac muscle itself, right? So we're saying that like our heart, our cardiac muscle, we know that reacts to the sympathetic nervous system. But now we're talking about the fact that the heart on the outside like needs to be fed. This is not what cardiac circulation actually looks like, right? But it needs to be fed by blood vessels on the outside. So the cells that we're talking about right now, right, are on the arterioles going to, for example, the heart. So we're talking about something like right here on that blood vessel. Just to make sure that we're reading that sentence correctly. Okay. So we're still talking about arterioles. Specifically, now we're talking about like the blood flow that's going to your skeletal muscle, blood flow that's going to the muscle of your heart, as opposed to like the inside of your heart to make the heart beat. So when we're talking about those two kind of organ systems, skeletal muscle and the heart, it's not just the alpha receptors. Okay? So what we have here instead is that we have a high concentration of these beta-2 receptors, right? So these beta-2 receptors are the ones that instead of preferring norepinephrine, they really like epinephrine instead, right? So they like that epinephrine. It's part of that pathway involving our adrenal glands, right? So we have epinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla, right? So producing epinephrine through that kind of part of the sympathetic pathway. Okay. So norepinephrine, when we emit it, is usually going to be binding to those alpha receptors. So the first one we talked about. So these alpha receptors out in the body, kind of everywhere, not the brain, are getting the norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system. And the result of those alpha receptors binding norepinephrine out in the body is vasoconstriction. So your brain sending a signal out through the peripheral nervous system, out through the autonomics, out through the fight or flight branch, that sympathetic nervous system, putting out norepinephrine from most of its nerves, right? The overall result when those nerves come in and touch your arterioles is that they're going to constrict. So in general, in response to the sympathetic nervous system, we have vasoconstriction, right? So that vasoconstriction is going to be raising resistance in all those places because we have those blood vessels getting smaller, right? So we're going to be kind of clamping down on blood flow throughout the body, right? And maybe affecting the blood pressure. Yeah. But when we involve the adrenal glands, right? So the adrenal glands are that middle root for our sympathetic nervous system, right? So we're still activating that same fight or flight part of the nervous system, but now we're thinking about the fact that the adrenal glands in response are mostly going to be emitting epinephrine. Right? Epinephrine is really, really grabbed by those beta-2 receptors, right? Because of this double arrow, right? It's telling you this is a really strong response. It does also bind to the alpha receptors, just not as strongly, right? So when it binds to an alpha receptor, so this first piece, right? It's going to have the same reaction as if norepinephrine bound there. So you can kind of think of like the effect on the blood vessel as being a response of that receptor, right? So alpha receptors alpha receptors, regardless of whether they're binding the norepinephrine or the epinephrine, are constricting these, right? So alpha receptors out in the body throughout constrict blood vessels in response to norepinephrine. They constrict blood vessels in response to epinephrine as well. Okay. However, if you have a beta-2 receptor, right, which we see in some blood vessels, and we know now that those blood vessels are ones going to our skeletal muscles, so those voluntary muscles, as well as the ones feeding the heart muscle itself, right? That's what we mean by some here, kind of, okay? We've got beta-2 receptors there, and the effect of that beta-2 receptor is dilation, right? So if a beta-2 receptor gets activated, it means that blood vessel is going to kind of swell, right? It's going to dilate, meaning that we are decreasing that resistance to that blood vessel, or in that blood vessel, which means we're going to increase flow there, right? So epinephrine, when we have some, you have just a little bit of epinephrine, because of that difference in affinity, it's going to go to the receptor that binds it more. So as you start to have epinephrine, it's going to more likely go to those beta-2 receptors. That's a lot of information. If we step back, we can start to kind of piece together what's going on when we might get stressed out or exercise, right? So sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight part, right? So you want to fight something or you want to run away. So what's happening here is that out in general in your body, because of all those alpha receptors, if we have our fight or flight part of the nervous system gearing up, it's causing constriction, right? So like, let's use the gut as an example of a place that we have an alpha receptor, right? So you're about to run away from something. You don't really want to be doing a bunch of digestion at that point, right? So those alpha receptors in blood flow to the gut constrict down. You're not going to get as much blood flow to the digestive system. But at the same time, we have some epinephrine coming in, still kind of part of the sympathetic response, right? And if it gets to alpha receptors in the gut, still causing constriction, but where we really have lots of those beta-2 receptors, which are really going to soak up that epinephrine, is our heart and our skeletal muscle, right? The reaction of those beta-2 receptors is to cause dilation, it's to cause those vessels to get bigger. So what we've done is clamped down blood flow to our gut. We've increased blood flow to the heart and the skeletal muscle, right? So now you're going to be able to have lots and lots of oxygen for your heart to pump faster, pump harder. And you're going to get lots and lots of oxygen to that skeletal muscle that can produce lots of ATP to fuel you as you run away. So that's like the big picture effect of what's going on here between the receptors, the blood flow, and the nerves. So, because of this difference between alpha receptors and beta receptors in their affinity for epinephrine, the effect overall is going to depend on how much epinephrine you have. So the concentration, right? So if you only have a little bit of epinephrine, right? It's not, your adrenal gland isn't really active, it's just like a little bit active. It's going to start out, right? So starting out as you're ramping up epinephrine concentrations, for example, it's going to go first to those beta-2 receptors because they're really greedy for epinephrine. Okay? So at first, when you have a little bit of epinephrine, we see vasodilation starting in the skeletal muscle and the heart, right? So epinephrine, first thing that happens is that we immediately start to get that skeletal muscle, the blood it needs. We start to get that heart, the blood it needs. As we get to higher concentrations, right? We talked way back when about this idea of saturation, right? So as we start to have more and more epinephrine, more and more of those beta-2 receptors are full, right? Like they already have some epinephrine bound to them. And just in general, we have more epinephrine flowing around to our body. So these higher concentrations, we've got enough kind of extra epinephrine that it can also bind to those alpha receptors, right? So they don't hate epinephrine. They just don't like it as much as they like norepinephrine. Okay. So in the skeletal and cardiac muscle, at this point in time, we still have vasodilation because that's just what the beta-2 receptors do. But the alpha receptors that we're now also binding to, the alpha receptors, regardless of what's bound to them, vasoconstrict. So everywhere else in the body, we have vasoconstriction. Now, the overall effect of epinephrine, especially at these higher concentrations, right? So if we're trying to get like our TPR, right, it's going to be vasoconstriction. So overall, your blood pressure is going to go up in this situation, but it hasn't gone up everywhere, right? And right when you started producing that epinephrine, right, it went first to the skeletal and cardiac muscle, which means that first we saw a little bit of a drop in peripheral resistance, decreasing the blood pressure. And then as that epinephrine concentration went up, we pulled that resistance back up in your system as a whole, getting the blood pressure back up. So like, if you start to run away, you don't want to get like super lightheaded and pass out, right? So you do want to maintain that blood pressure, but you do need that vasodilation to start so that you can get blood to your muscles and your heart to fuel your body. Okay, so this is the overall effect of our sympathetic nervous system on our body. Okay. So next time, we'll kind of review this. Like really, these next couple slides mostly say what I've been saying to you out loud. We got a couple extra details and rephrases. And then next week, we'll go into the capillaries. I'll post exactly what I want you to take a look at right after class. But if you haven't finished looking at those questions for 14.3, do that. That was the stuff about intrinsic and extrinsic regulation. And then we're going to be starting capillaries. Our biggest topic in capillaries is going to be the section on movement across the capillary walls. So the most important thing to help you get the most out of class is going to be making sure you can define filtration and absorption and a little bit of understanding of hydrostatic pressures versus osmotic pressures. So I'll get this back up.